Breath of the Wild was a spectacle beyond all of our wildest imaginations, especially considering the game before in the series was the most linear affair in a Zelda game. But when we were given a trailer of what was to come in Breath of the Wild, the community was absolutely set alight. Personally, I wasn't part of the community at that point in time, but I can definitely see the excitement through older YouTube videos, as YouTube saves history forevermore. The trailer had everyone wondering, to what extent would this open format be taken to? Surely the world can't be that big, it'd throw off the entire series. And yes, my friends, the game really was that big. However, one thing that was inexplicably missing from the first game was for sure some sort of underwater exploration. The game was still the most open Zelda game by a large margin, please don't get me wrong, but I think that everyone sort of just expected some sort of underwater exploration, considering almost every single game in the series has offered some sort of cool, unique underwater experiences. Unfortunately, this system was completely missing. Link could climb, he could run, he could jump, a thing that many thought he'd never do using a button, yet he could not dive in water. So today, I'd like to take another look into Breath of the Wild 2 speculation, and let's talk about underwater exploration in a little bit more detail. Well, I think that first of all we should run back to the root of the problem here. The reason why we all want and expect underwater exploration in our Zelda games. Well, I think we should look through some games that already incorporate underwater exploration in a relatively open world. Then we'll move into how some Zelda games have already used underwater exploration in the past. This is probably a weird game to bring up at the beginning of a video, but I have played a fair amount of a game called Subnautica. Some of you may know what you do in that game, but please let me explain. The main gist is that it is a sandbox game in the same vein as something like Minecraft, but is set in completely open waters. Stick with me here. The game is nothing like a Zelda game at all. A sandbox game is nothing like an adventure game, believe it or not. But just indulge for a second. In Subnautica you go around obviously looking for materials to progress in the game. Next case study, the Assassin's Creed games. Possibly the most notable is Assassin's Creed Odyssey in this regard. The series is notorious for the fact that Ubisoft puts countless collectibles all over the place. And would you look at that, in Odyssey and Black Flag there were basically collectible shipwrecks that would ultimately lead up to a goal. Would this work in a Breath of the Wild setting? Well, would we never know if the Zelda team didn't just try? I'll go into some cool examples later on, but I think that being able to explore underwater in some of the more mystical areas of Hyrule could really heighten my enjoyment of the game. Having to find collectibles such as shipwrecks or a real alternative to Koroks while also trying to keep a handle on your stamina in the sequel to an already phenomenal game could be exhilarating. I personally find that when games incorporate underwater elements, I seem to just enjoy the game more. I think it's purely because water is all over the globe, and there are so many mysteries about the deep sea that we can't even interpret in real life. Again, I'll really dig into that later on. But I think with the other software developers slowly going into an open-ended underwater exploration format, that it is now a huge vat of opportunity wasted if the Zelda team didn't just try and do it. You could be thinking, you keep saying this, but realistically, how likely is it that we could see underwater exploration in Breath of the Wild sequel? Well, let me explain that to you. First of all, let's move back. The first semblance of all underwater exploration in the series technically stems from Link's Awakening on the Game Boy. It wasn't great, but it was very exciting at the time, I'm sure. Being able to just swim downwards in a 2D side-to-side section would have at the very least got me hyped about what was next for underwater happenings in the series. Well, it would be a while until they see a true underwater exploration system. It would finally come in the critically acclaimed Ocarina of Time. It was finally a true realization of what people have been waiting for. Link could swim and had a diving ability, and all of this was already good enough for a lot of people. But even if people were happy with that, the team went further and included the Blue Tunic, a tunic that would let the hero of time breathe underwater without any sort of worries. The only catch was that the hero had to equip the iron boots, and yeah, I'll admit, it was a bit annoying in the N64 version, but the 3DS version improved on the iron boots significantly, making for a great first 3D underwater experience that almost every single player enjoyed, even if we had to wait for the 3DS version for a smooth experience. The game that's included underwater exploration the most in my opinion is Majora's Mask. The main mechanic in that game was the infamous mask mechanic. You could turn into 3 other races rather than keeping to Hylian inheritance. You could play as a Deku Scrub, a Goron, and most importantly to this conversation particularly is the Zora. If you put on the Zora mask, as well as just a terrifying cutscene, you can then soar into the water much like a Zora would. And while the 3DS version actually butchered this system in a way, the N64 version had you seemingly effortlessly swerving around in the water. No thought was needed, all you had to do was swim in whichever direction was necessary, and this proves to be a great centre point for one of the game's main dungeons, the Great Bay Temple. Wind Waker is a weird one. The game is mostly all about water. You look around the open seas and water is everywhere. Even the logo of the game is a boat, for crying out loud. But there is no underwater exploration at all. There's technically a story reason why they did this, but I still think it was a missed opportunity. One thing it did have was a treasure hunting mechanic in Spirit. If a circle popped up on the sea, you pressed a button and lowered your hook down. Technically not exploration, but I might as well cover all of my bases. Twilight Princess. This went back to a similar system to Majora's Mask in a way, by giving the player access to such a thing as a Zora Tunic. This would allow Link to breathe underwater like the blue tunic in Ocarina of Time, and the player could swim. This would make for an interesting boss battle with an enormous sea creature, even though it was a laughably easy boss. And Skyward Sword also used a similar system, but you could thrust forward and jump out of the water if necessary. Overall, in the 3D games, underwater exploration has definitely been explored a tiny bit. Breath of the Wild's open nature surely needed to use it. It's such a perfect fit, and yet it did not. So let's quickly discuss what system was in place for the first truly open Zelda experience. Breath of the Wild had many ways of traversing the enormous land of Hyrule. You are no doubt aware of just how crazy the scope of this game was. I must have mentioned it in this video about a dozen times already, but out of the ways to make your way around the land, only 3 actually involved you doing something on water. First of all is something that we've seen in almost every single Zelda game. This was just pure and simple swimming. Breath of the Wild included a stamina gorge, or gauge, into its expansive view and progression, so the more that you upgraded your stamina, the longer that you could swim. It's pretty basic game design really for an open world game. The lack of stamina in past Zelda games has kind of brought the experience of the older games down for me in repeat playthroughs since Breath of the Wild has come out, truthfully. The next way that the game had you traversing lakes was with Cryonis. I only ever used this for gaps in water with a strong current, and it seems it may not return in the next game, so I'm not going to cover it too much here, but I will say that it was definitely fun to make stepping stones across water for Link to jump across, even if he did slip and fall in the water sometimes. The final way to traverse the lakes and rivers was by using rafts. Now, I loved this system in concept. I've said this before and I will say it many times. Being able to just hop on a raft and using a Korok leaf to move in whichever direction you please with just a touch of a button depending on the current of the water flow and the wind speed and direction was extremely well done. My biggest issue with this system is that it got used to such a minimal extent in the first game that it felt like a traversal option that I simply did not need to use, and that's before you take Rivali's Gale into consideration. As soon as I finished Divine Beast Vamedo, I took Rivali's Gale and I don't think I ever swam again. I'm seriously glad that I've finished Valruta before Vamedo, because I wouldn't have swam in Lanayru half as much if some of the champion's abilities were available to me at that point. The sad thing about the boating in Breath of the Wild was purely the dashed potential. I loved being able to whiz around on a boat in certain lakes and rivers, but really, what was the reason to do it? The only reason I still do it to this day is to lie there with Link and dream up a true system where Link could really use a boat on an open sea resembling Wind Waker, and for Link to just dive down and see coral and other sea creatures going about their days. But this is where I think we have hope. There is a sequel, which means that ideas that had potential in the first game could now fully realise their potential. So I think it's time to really talk about how they could do underwater exploration in Breath of the Wild 2. We've seen that the new Horizon Zero Dawn has some sort of underwater exploration, and if Breath of the Wild 2 has it, I think it'll be somewhat similar. Obviously Nintendo has nothing to do with Horizon, but I have a good feeling that it will be something close to it. As I've already mentioned, I think of a system such as the heart containers or the stamina gorge, or gauge, that acts as lung capacity, similar to GTA 5. I dream of Link jumping off of a raft or a cliff on the side of the map. You can press an unmapped button while swimming, such as B, to prompt the hero to dive down into the waters, and you can then marvel at the sea creatures down there with you. The catch here is that nothing would be like how it is in real life. Instead, all fishes are brand new breeds. Instead of calling a fish a clownfish, the Zelda could call a fish a pencilfish, and it could be the size of a pinky finger. When cooked, these fish restore a very small amount of health that will really only help you during battles earlier on in the game. This idea alone gets me excited, but how about we talk about giant sea creatures? Not a single game set in the ocean that I've ever played has given me a truly scary experience with a sea creature. The only thing that's come close is the Kraken in Sea of Thieves, but you never still see its face. And that is what I think a Zelda game could do. We've seen giant creatures in Zelda games before, sure, Morpheo jumps to mind in this department. But I mean enormous creatures, something to rival a real-life megalodon that could literally eat the size of the Great Plateau. The easiest way to implement this sort of creature would have to be having it actually eat a section of the map some point in the next game's story. then you're suddenly in its stomach. Its stomach could then serve as a smaller open area that you can explore before being spat out for some sort of story reasons. Perhaps it could be an open-ended dungeon like Hyrule Castle. As an aside, I'd like to note that this would be an amazing callback to Ocarina of Time's inside of Jabu Jabu dungeon. Actually, maybe this is a really good time to cycle into the easiest use of underwater traversal and the most common use in the series. This would mean that you would get some sort of linear progression system to take you to Lake Hylia, and I think you all know what's coming next. Either using something like the Iron Boots or by using the previously proposed lung capacity idea, you can swim down to the very bottom of Lake Hylia, perhaps even with some items that you've gained in the game, and you could fight through an entire dungeon that's underwater. I think that the reason why some water dungeons haven't been taken well traditionally is because the dungeons are only ever supplemented with water. If the idea was taken all the way with water combat and everything, I don't think many people would mind too much. The other key bit of potential that I think was sorely lacking was just Lake Hylia in Breath of the Wild. It was the most underwhelming variant of the lake that we've seen in the series in my opinion. Nothing substantial happened there at all, not even in the story as I recall. It always felt like after the Divine Beast there would be one more dungeon underneath the lake, similar to Twilight Princess's Lakebed Temple, but this hope never came to fruition. A final way in which I would love to see the underwater side of Hyrule explored is by an earlier idea. I'd love to explore just to explore. Now hear me out here. Diving down for hours on end to find shrines and possibly a Korok equivalent would be close to perfect and would add countless hours to my playtime. My one worry with this whole underwater idea would be the graphics underwater, but I trust the Zelda team with that bit. So I think that's all of my ideas for underwater exploration. What are some of your ideas? Do you think that I missed any out? If you have your own ideas, then please put them down in the comments. Well, we've come to that time once again. But no fear, I'll have a new video out before the Game Awards, on Wednesday at the same time as I released it today, 6 PM UK time. If you don't want to miss that, then please do like this video and subscribe. I'm trying to push for 600 subscribers by the end of the year, but I must say thank you so much for the support recently. It really has been heartwarming. A thank you video is in the description as well that I put out in the week. If you want to join these amazing people on screen, then please do consider pledging some money to my Patreon as it helps me out to no end. The link to my Patreon and my countless other media platforms are in the description. With all of that said, I hope you're all having an amazing day, have an amazing week, and I will see you on Wednesday.